Hello and welcome to Written Words. I'm Helen and I enjoy reading old books. But for someone who might be just venturing into the world of old books, it can be quite daunting. So in this video, I'm going to share some ways that might help you to get more out of the experience and enjoy reading old books. As you can probably see from behind me, and from many of my earlier videos, I have a lot of old books. And what I mean by old books is not necessarily books that were printed a long time ago, but books that were written a long time ago. And many of these are today regarded as classics. So if old classics are new to you, what can you do to enjoy the process of reading them? I'm going to share a few ideas and then we're going to have a look at an example of a big old book. My first piece of advice would be to adjust your expectations. Reading old classics is a very different thing to reading modern fiction. So if you're used to reading a lot of modern fiction, you will need to adjust your expectations when you pick up an old book. What exactly do I mean by that? Well, first of all, the older the book, the older the language that the author uses. The language in an old book will be very different to the language we speak today, and the older the book is, the more different the language will be. So a modern writer, let's take Stephen King for example, will be writing in the language that we speak today, whereas Shakespeare, at the other end of the spectrum, is speaking in the language that was normal in the time that he lived. So we have to adjust the way we approach reading that in order to appreciate it. Also, fashions and styles of writing change over the years. So again, the older a book is, the more it will feel different. Modern fiction is very much plot-based. It's all about story, it's all about pace, and it's all about keeping the reader engaged so they want to keep turning the pages to find out what happens next. But old books are not necessarily like that. Older books tended to be much heavier on description, and some classics, Dostoevsky is a particular pro at this, spend pages and pages considering philosophical questions. If Dostoevsky were to submit, say, Brothers Karamazov to a modern literary editor, a lot of his long philosophical passages might be edited out because they slow down the pace. So when you approach an old classic, approach it with the mindset of a reader who would be reading it at the time it was first published. If it helps, you could even dress up in the costume of the time. Another aspect which can often put off modern readers from reading old books is the different cultural values that people had in the past. A book will reflect the values of the time when it was written, and they can be very different to what we consider normal now, and sometimes can be quite uncomfortable to read. For example, different views on gender roles or racial stereotypes. So again, when you're approaching the book, you have to do it with the mindset of a reader at the time when the book was written. If we judge an old book with modern values, that can be very problematic and can make the reading very difficult. A good idea for something you can do before you start reading is to perhaps find out a little bit of background about the book and the author, what other events were going on at the time that this book was written. Who was the author? Where did they come from? What was their background? What were their beliefs and philosophies on life? One thing that it is important to avoid, though, is reading any plot summaries. If you search for information about a book on the internet, be very careful that you don't accidentally read a plot summary, because that may very well contain spoilers. So just look for background about the author, about how the book came to be written, and about what was going on at the time that the book was written. One piece of advice I've often given to people who want to start reading classics is to start gently by reading children's classics. Children's books tend by nature to be shorter and more straightforward. The language isn't quite so complex, there isn't quite so much philosophising, and there's usually a really good story there as well. So children's books are often a very good way in to the classics. And children's classics are often quite different to children's books now. Some of the children's classics are really quite adult in nature anyway. As a child, I absolutely devoured the classics. And some of my favourites were Little Women by Louisa May Alcott, The Railway Children by E. Nesbit, Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson, and The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame. That's just a small selection. There are hundreds of children's classics to choose from, depending on the type of story you like to read. Then when you've tried some children's books, perhaps you might like to progress on to some shorter adult books. A lot of old classics are very big and very heavy. Dickens, for example, is famous for his very big books. This is the one I'm reading at the moment. It's 800 pages long and the print in the book is tiny. So for someone who's not used to reading classics, that can be quite off-putting to start with. So if you are wanting to explore Dickens, I recommend that you start with something like A Christmas Carol. It has all Dickens' great hallmarks. It has his beautiful use of language. It has a very theatrical storyline, and it's just a very good read. But it's much shorter. This version is just 124 pages, and the print is nowhere near as tiny, so it's not as off-putting. A couple of other classics that are smaller and easier to get into are A Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. It's a very dark psychological story as we follow the demise of the main character, who is obsessed with remaining young. And this obsession with being young is so overwhelming and all-consuming that it eventually drives him to do something really terrible. It's a good story, it's quite short, and although there is a philosophical element to it, it's very readable. And another classic that I recommend for beginners is Dracula. This book is a little longer than the other two. It's about 350 pages in this edition, but it's a comparatively easy read. This is what we call an epistolary novel. An epistolary novel is a novel that is based on letters, and this book consists of letters and diary entries. So it's all in bite-sized chunks. And of course, the story is very exciting too. So when you've tried a few children's classics and then some shorter adult ones, then you might feel quite comfortable about progressing onto the weightier tomes of classic literature. A piece of really useful advice I was given a long time ago and really appreciated is to read a copy of the book with notes in the back, if at all possible. My copy of Our Mutual Friend contains many pages of notes at the back, and I'm finding them very useful. They explain words or cultural references that a modern reader might not be familiar with. However, if your copy doesn't have notes in the back, that's not too much of a problem because we have the internet these days. You can still look up words and references that are not familiar to you. However, I do recommend, if you're doing it that way, do it at the end of each chapter. Don't look up a word as soon as you see it. Underline it or make a note to look it up at the end of the chapter. If you look it up straight away, then you risk becoming distracted by your phone or your computer and falling down an internet rabbit hole. And that will break the flow of your reading, and it might spoil your enjoyment of the book. I don't, however, recommend that you look up every single word and phrase that isn't familiar to you. The more you look up, the more it breaks the flow of your reading and the less you will enjoy the story. So make peace with the idea that you don't need to understand every single word. Just prioritise looking up the things that are key to your understanding and enjoyment of the book. If you're reading the book for study purposes, however, rather than just enjoyment, then perhaps that advice might be slightly different. There is one particular tool that can aid enjoyment of an old and complicated book, and that is the pencil. If you can, if it's your own copy of the book, then make notes as you go along. Circle things that you want to look up later. Underline the good bits that you really like and might want to come back to. And jot down notes in the margin as if you're preparing for a group discussion the next day and you want to mention that particular point in the conversation. Because making notes helps to focus your thoughts. Incidentally, reading with a group or just another person and discussing the book chapter by chapter can really help your understanding and enjoyment of a book. It can be a really beneficial experience all round. So I do recommend, if you do get the opportunity to read a book with other people, then do take it. If, however, you can't make notes in the book, if it's somebody else's book or it's a library book, or you really don't want to write in the book, then have a notebook handy. Jot down your thoughts, write down your favourite quotations from the book, partly so that you can come back to it later for reference, and partly because the act of writing these things down helps to process what you've read in your mind as well. One thing that I've often heard people complain about with regard to old classic books is that the characters are confusing. This is a comment I often hear about Russian literature because Russian names can be very difficult for English-speaking readers. But if you do find the characters in a book confusing, there are some things that you can do to help. Try making a list as you're reading. Jot down the names of the characters, and when you come across any information about those characters, jot that information down too, so that you can use your notes as a reference when you meet a character later in the book, when you think, was that her brother or her cousin? I can't remember. Look at your notes, they may have the answer. However, another thing to avoid is looking characters up on the internet. It's something that I have done to my detriment a few times. It's very tempting, if you're reading a book, to look up the characters on the internet. When I started reading the Forsyte Saga by John Galsworthy, which I'm going to come back to in a moment, it was very confusing at the beginning. The book opens with a family party and the whole extended family is at the party. There are aunts, uncles, cousins, friends, grandmas, husbands, wives, children. Everybody is at the party. And there are a lot of names. And I thought I was never going to get the hang of who was who and who was related to who. And I had heard that some copies of the book contain a family tree at the beginning. Unfortunately, mine doesn't. So I thought, I'll have a look on the internet because somebody's bound to have posted it on the internet somewhere. And indeed they had. There were several versions of the family tree of the Forsyte family on the internet. However, what I hadn't expected was that the family tree would contain spoilers. It told me who was going to get married to who was going to get divorced, who was going to have children, and who they were going to have children with, and so on. So it spoiled some of the story because I knew what was coming, particularly in relation to two of the principal characters. So do make your own notes on characters, but do avoid looking them up on the internet because sometimes you might find too much information out there. And then when you've finished reading the book, another thing that you can do is to write a book review. And when you've written it, you could share it on Goodreads or Amazon, on social media, or just with your friends. keep them in a notebook so that you can go back and look at them later and remember the books that you've read. And the process of writing it will help you to digest what you've read and what you thought about the characters, the plot, the style, the language, and so on. And if you share it with other people, it might just be of use to someone else who was thinking of reading the book. So that's just a handful of tips to help you get more out of your reading when you're reading old books. So let's take a look now at a couple of examples from an old book. We're going to look at the Forsyte Saga, which I mentioned earlier. This version has 800 pages of very small print, and in fact it's actually 3 books in one. It's an old book. It was written at the beginning of the 20th century. And it contains a lot of the elements that can be problematic to modern day readers. It has long words. There is philosophising, and the first chapter, as I've already mentioned, contains so many characters, it is very confusing. It has a lot of description, and the characters, and presumably the author too, have some values that could be quite problematic to a modern day reader. There is, for example, a lot of misogyny. The main character is a very unpleasant man. There are a couple of dubious racial references too. However, it is representative of the way these characters would have thought and felt and acted at that time. But despite all of those problematic elements, it is a really good story. I really enjoyed it. It has a huge variety of characters. It has all kinds of intrigue and scandal. Its plot is actually quite similar to that of a modern day soap opera. There is a lot going on and it's quite exciting. So I'm going to focus in on 2 passages from the book. First of all, we're going to look at the opening paragraph, and then we're going to look at a scene from further into the novel and compare them. The opening paragraph is quite long. It contains some long words. It contains philosophising. And if it were the opening of a 21st century novel, a lot of readers would put it down straight away. So let's take a look at this opening paragraph and work out what the best way is to approach that in order to enjoy the rest of the book. Those privileged to be present at a family festival of the Forsytes have seen that charming and instructive sight, an upper middle class family in full plumage. But whosoever of these favoured persons has possessed the gift of psychological analysis, a talent without monetary value and properly ignored by the Forsytes, has witnessed a spectacle not only delightful in itself, but illustrative of an obscure human problem. In plainer words, he has gleaned from a gathering of this family, no branch of which had a liking for the other, between no 3 members of whom existed anything worthy of the name of sympathy, evidence of that mysterious, concrete tenacity which renders a family so formidable a unit of society, so clear a reproduction of society in miniature. He has been admitted to a vision of the dim roads of social progress, has understood something of patriarchal life, of the swarmings of savage hordes, of the rise and fall of nations. He is like one who, having watched a tree grow from its planting, a paragon of tenacity, insulation and success amidst the deaths of 100 other plants less fibrous, sappy and persistent, one day will see it flourishing with bland, full foliage, in an almost repugnant prosperity at the summit of its efflorescence. Wow, there are some long words in that paragraph. The author is not exactly easing us into the book at all. In fact, with this book, it's the other way round. The opening is very difficult, but as the story gets going, it actually gets a lot easier to read, as we'll see in a moment. So what can we get from this chapter? As I said earlier, don't worry about understanding every single word and every single philosophical concept that it presents, because there is so much in there. If you're writing an essay on it, by all means, look everything up and explore it very deeply. But if you're just wanting to enjoy the story, all you need to do is identify the bits that matter. What is this opening paragraph telling us? How is it preparing us for the story that's to come? So let's take a closer look and identify those elements that are going to help us enjoy the story that's coming. The first word that is key in the first sentence is family. This is the Forsyte Saga. So it's a story about the Forsyte family. This particular book is 3 novels in one, but there are also a series of other sequels that came after that as well, because it's not just about one character, it's about a whole family. And as families do, people come and go all the time, and families are constantly changing, and their story is constantly playing itself out. So family is important, and it's the Forsyte family. And then we're told it's an upper middle class family, which is quite key to the story as well. And we have a beautiful way that the authors expressed that. We're told it's an upper middle class family in full plumage. So they're showing themselves off to their best, presumably because they're at a party, they're all wearing their best outfits, and they're all on their best behaviour, showing themselves off in the best way they can. The next reference that's quite key to the story is that psychological analysis is a talent without monetary value, and it's properly ignored by the Forsytes. This is telling us that the Forsytes care about money. If something has monetary value, they care about it, but if it doesn't, they're not interested. And that is going to be key to the storyline. The men of the Forsyte family are businessmen. It's a novel about real estate as well as about family. And money is an important aspect of that. But as well as real estate, it's about family. And the next piece of useful information is that no branch of the family had a liking for the other. And between no 3 members of the family existed anything worthy of the name of sympathy. So this gives us a hint that there are problems in the family. There are tensions in the family. There are people who don't necessarily get on terribly well together in this family. And of course that is going to make for an exciting storyline. And then a couple of other key themes of the story are also mentioned in this paragraph. We are told about social progress. Because this is an upper middle class family, they are interested in social progress. They're not upper class, but they want to be as close to that as they possibly can. They want to climb the social ladder. And it also mentions patriarchal life. I made reference earlier to the misogyny in the book, and it is indeed a patriarchal life that these characters live. So the role of men and women in the book is quite different to what we would expect now, although it is very representative of the time in which the book is set. And then the final sentence of this paragraph is talking about a tree that is a paragon of tenacity, insulation and success. And as it's growing, it's seeing the deaths of 100 other plants, less fibrous, sappy and persistent. So it's talking about survival of the fittest. It's talking about the philosophy of the Forsyte family. They are social climbers, and they want to succeed whatever the cost. They're not interested in the other 100 plants who are less fibrous, sappy and persistent. They're not worried about how many other people they will trample on in their pursuit of their social goals. So that is the first paragraph of the book, and it is arguably the heaviest paragraph of the book too. It does get easier as you go along. There are a lot of characters at this party who we meet all in one go, but gradually we get to know them one by one. We come to root for some of them, and we love to hate some of the others, especially the main character Soames, who is a real villain. So let's look now at a scene further on in the book where the action is properly underway and it really is becoming rather soap opera-like. There are quite a lot of exciting scenes that I could have picked, but it was quite difficult not to pick one that contained too many spoilers. "Don't touch me!" she cried. He caught her wrist. She wrenched it away. "And where may you have been?" he asked. "In heaven, out of this house." With those words she fled upstairs. Outside, in Thanksgiving, at the very door, the organ grinder was playing the waltz. And Soames stood motionless. What prevented him from following her? Was it that, with the eyes of faith, he saw Bosinney looking down from that high window in Sloane Street, straining his eyes for yet another glimpse of Irene's vanished figure, cooling his flushed face, dreaming of the moment when she flung herself on his breast, the scent of her still in the air around, and the sound of her laugh that was like a sob? So the tone of that extract is really very different from the first one. There are some quite scandalous, emotional scenes that have led to it, and there are more that come afterwards as well. So that's just a little example from one book that could be quite problematic to a reader who is new to this type of reading. It can, of course, take time to get used to reading old books, to get the feel for the language and the style. But the more you read, the easier it gets, and hopefully it will become a very rewarding experience and you will discover some new favourite books. If you are someone who is just dipping your toes into the water of old classic books, do let me know which ones you're reading, and if, like me, you are someone who's read a lot of them, which ones did you start with, and which ones are now your favourites? Thank you very much for joining me in this video. If you enjoyed exploring old books with me in this video, there are plenty more other videos on the channel which explore other old books, both those originally written in English as well as some that have been translated from other languages into English. And there are, of course, plenty more videos about reading and writing old and modern books still to come. So once again, thank you very much for watching. I look forward to seeing you in the next video, and in the meantime, happy reading and happy writing.